They told you Greece was the birthplace of civilization, but they never told you who taught the Greeks how to read. They praised the student and erased the teacher. Listen, before there was Plato, there were priests in Kemet reading stars like open books. Before there was Aristotle, there were black scribes carving eternity into stone. Before they had philosophy, we had machat, balance, order, truth, not as theory, but as the way the Nile breathed. They said Western thought. But the roots were watered by the Nile. They said Greek genius. But the textbooks go quiet when you ask, then why did your geniuses travel south, sit at African feet, and call it enlightenment? This isn't about hating Greece. This is about naming the original source, about saying with our whole chest that the library of humanity had black architects. They sold you a story where civilization starts in Europe. I'm here to flip the camera and show you the wide shot. Temples older than their legends, mathematics before their myths, medicine before their gods had names. They turned our ancestors into a backdrop, hieroglyphs into mystery, black brilliance into influence footnotes at the bottom of the page. No, we're not doing that anymore. If Greece is the chapter they worship, Africa is the book they tried to bury. And in this series, we're digging it back up. They keep saying Western civilization started in Greece. Started? Nah, Greece was the remix. Africa was the original track. Let's talk plain. While Europe was still trying to figure out how to bathe regularly, Kemet, what they now call ancient Egypt, was running universities without calling them universities. Temple schools, mystery systems, houses of life, math, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, engineering, not as theories, but as tools to build nations, align with the stars, and keep a whole civilization in rhythm with the Nile. Europe was guessing at the weather. Africa was mapping the cosmos. They tell you about Pythagoras. They don't tell you Pythagoras spent about 20 years in Kemet, studying under African priests, learning from black minds who carved equations into stone before his people could even carve their own names right. They praise Plato. They quote Aristotle. They bow to Socrates, but ask them this: where did their masters go to be mastered? To Africa, to Nile Valley libraries, to temples that were part classroom, part laboratory, part spiritual dojo. You think it's a coincidence that Greek philosophy shows up after Greek visits to Kemet? History doesn't move like that. You don't go to the source thirsty and come back dry. They walked into Africa as students, walked out of Africa as founders. They turned field trips into origin stories. Europe wrote the book report and erased the author. They took Imhotep, the African genius who was doctor, architect, high priest, astronomer, and buried his name under father of medicine, Hippocrates. But long before Hippocrates took an oath, Imhotep was diagnosing, treating, performing surgery, documenting over 200 medical conditions on papyrus that Europe later looted, copied, then called Greek thought. They hid the blueprint, then worshipped the cheap copy. Let's draw the line clear. Africa was building pyramids so precise, modern engineers still scratch their heads. Europe was building huts and hoping winter didn't erase them. Africa was measuring the Earth's circumference with shadows and sticks. Europe was calling thunder the anger of some sky god. Africa was charting star systems, aligning temples with solstices, tracking time across thousands of years. Europe was arguing over which tribe owned which muddy patch of land. But when the story gets told, they flip the script. They show you marble statues, hide the black stone foundations. They show you Greek letters, hide the Medu-Neter, the sacred scripts that fed those letters. They show you white columns, hide the black architects who inspired them. This is how theft looks when it's dressed in a toga. They say, the Greeks were the first philosophers. No, the Greeks were the first celebrated philosophers in a world where Africa was silenced on purpose. Because if they ever admit that the mind they worship sat at the feet of African teachers, The whole fantasy of Western superiority cracks. And that's what they fear. They don't fear the truth because it's wrong. They fear the truth because it's right. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Understand, Greece is not the villain for learning. Learning is human. The crime was not the learning. The crime was the erasing, taking African science, African philosophy, African spirituality, stripping the melanin off it, repackaging it in marble and myth, and selling it back to the world as European genius. That's not genius, that's forgery. So when they say Western thought began with the Greeks, you answer, no. Western lies began with the Greeks. Human thought has always had an African heartbeat. Europe dressed in white robes, Africa wrapped in silence. But that silence is breaking. The stones are talking again. The Nile is remembering. And in this series, we're not just giving credit back. We're pulling the mask off. Next, we're going deeper into the temples, the libraries, the stolen scrolls, and the quiet war they waged on African memory. Because once you know who taught Greece, you start asking a bigger question. If they lied about the beginning, what else did they bury? They told you civilization started in some marble hallway in Europe, under a statue with a broken nose and a missing arm. But the real story, it started where the sun kisses the Nile good morning, where stone remembers, where black hands carved time into temples. Let's talk about that. They praise Plato like he dreamed in a vacuum, like he woke up one day and just discovered wisdom. But Plato went to Kemet, Pythagoras went to Kemet, Solon, Thales, Democritus. These boys were tourists in African universities. They sat at the feet of black priests in libraries that smelled like papyrus and incense, in temples aligned with the stars, so perfect NASA would nod in respect. You think it's a coincidence that Greek philosophy shows up after Greek visitors spent years in Egypt? Nah, that's not coincidence. That's curriculum. Europe writes books calling itself the cradle of civilization. Africa was writing in stone while Europe was still arguing with fire and fur. Europe paints the Greeks as the fathers of philosophy. Africa had mystery schools, initiation systems, codes of Ma'at, truth, justice, balance, running the whole society while Europe was still figuring out how not to drink from the same river it used as a toilet. They call it Greek geometry. But the Nile flooded every year, and African surveyors had to remeasure the land, redraw the borders, recalculate the taxes. That's geometry in real time, on real soil, with real consequences. They call it Greek medicine. But Imhotep, an African, was diagnosing, operating, stitching, building step pyramids before Hippocrates' ancestors even knew what a clinic was. They call it Greek philosophy. But the questions they brag about, what is the soul, what is justice, what is the good life, those were already carved in hieroglyphs, acted out in rituals, lived through Ma'at, centuries before some toga touched a podium. See, Europe is loud with its lies. Africa was quiet with its mastery. Europe. Oh, look what we discovered. Africa. We been new, we been did. But power loves a good costume, so they dressed African wisdom in Greek clothing, gave it a new accent, a whiter face, and called it Western thought. They didn't just borrow, they rebranded. And then they turned around and called the source primitive. Imagine that. You teach somebody how to read, they copy your notes, steal your books, burn your library, then write history calling you the illiterate one. That's not just theft, that's spiritual fraud. Let's be clear, the Greeks were not fools. They were students, curious, hungry. They came to Africa because Africa was the motherboard. But Europe, later on, Europe turned that student story into a savior story. They turned, we learned from them, into, we gave the world light. Nah, the light was already shining on the Nile, reflecting off pyramids and jet black skin, centuries before a Greek even touched a chisel. And this is why they work so hard to cut Africa out of the frame. because if the world ever really accepts that African minds trained Greek legends, then the whole Western ego takes a hit. Those universities built on the Greek tradition have to admit they're sitting on African foundations. Those classics departments have to admit they're teaching secondhand wisdom from a people they spent centuries calling savages. Those museums full of ancient Mediterranean art have to admit half of that Mediterranean was just African with a lighting change. They erased the black from the pharaoh's face. They buried the African from the philosopher's past. They split Egypt from Africa on the map, like the Nile doesn't know where it flows from. All so Europe could say, "We are the beginning." But the stones don't lie. The stars don't lie. The timelines don't lie. When the Greeks arrived, Africa was already ancient, already advanced, already in conversation with the cosmos. They walked into a lecture already in progress. So, when you hear Greek thought, Greek science, Greek philosophy, translate it correctly, African wisdom processed through Greek mouths marketed by Europe. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start asking, if the teachers were African and the students were Greek, why did the students end up in the textbooks and the teachers end up in chains? If the roots are African, why is Europe selling the fruit like it grew the tree? And if they lied about who taught Greece, what else did they bury under marble, myth, and museum glass? Stay with me. Next, we're walking into those temples, unrolling those stolen scrolls, and calling the teachers by their real names. Because this time, Africa signs her own work. Picture this. They tell you Western civilization like it fell out the sky with blue eyes and a toga. Nah, let's rewind the tape. Before Greece had a philosophy, Africa had a way of life. Before Plato was thinking deeply, priests in Kemet were calculating the heartbeat of the Nile, mapping the stars like a family tree, turning the sky into a textbook. But Europe wrote the movie, cast themselves as the first thinkers, the only geniuses, the fathers of reason. Meanwhile, Africa, they wrote her in as myth, as mystery, as tribal. You see the trick? They didn't just steal the jewels, they stole the story of who made the jewels. Let's talk names. Pythagoras, that triangle man they worship in math class, he studied in Kemet for years, sat at the feet of African masters, learned sacred geometry from people who carved equations into stone while his homeland was still arguing with the alphabet. Plato, he wasn't born in a vacuum. He walked through Egyptian temples, stared at walls that already had his ideas painted in living color. Herodotus, father of history, walked through Africa with his jaw on the floor, wrote about black people towering in wisdom. But by the time the story hits your school desk, Africa is a shadow and Greece is the sun. That's not an accident. That's editing. That's forgery. That's plagiarism with a passport and a PhD. Europe built museums. Africa built civilizations. Europe collected artifacts. Africa produced the blueprint. Europe wrote books about the gods. Africa raised pyramids that still whisper at the stars. They call Greece the cradle of civilization. Funny, because every cradle needs a mother, and that mother's name is Africa. They don't tell you about the mystery schools along the Nile where students fasted, studied, purified before they were allowed near the real knowledge. Medicine, math, astronomy, ethics, spirit, and science braided together like cornrows. Europe came on field trips. Africa was the university. They took notes, went back home, translated the lessons into their own language, and then had the nerve to stamp their own names on the cover like Africa was just the chalkboard. Understand this, Greece was a student. Africa was the teacher. But when the report card came out, Europe gave itself the A+ and marked Africa illiterate. They erased the black faces on the walls, broke the noses off the statues, buried the records, then told the world, these people never did anything. Imagine robbing a house, moving in, then calling the original owners homeless. That's what they did to Africa. So when they say Greek philosophy, Greek math, Greek science, hear it correctly. African knowledge, wearing a Greek mask. They want you to believe Africa was late to the party. Truth is, Africa built the house, lit the fire, cooked the food, then watched uninvited guests sit at the table and call themselves hosts. But the walls remember, the stones remember, the stars remember, and now so do you. We're not begging for credit. We're restoring the record. We're not asking permission. We're repossessing the narrative. Because when you know that your ancestors taught the world, you stop walking like a student and start moving like a founder. And founders don't imitate. Founders originate. Next, we're naming the receipts, country by country, scroll by scroll, showing exactly how the Greek miracle was powered by African light. They had the stage. We had the script. This time, we're taking our lines back. They called it Western civilization, like it was born in a marble temple under a blue-eyed sky. But let's stop the movie right there. Rewind the reel. Pull the camera back. Before Greece had philosophers, Kemet had priests, scribes, healers, architects, astronomers, mapping the language of the stars while Europe was still trying to figure out how to bathe regularly. They teach you. Plato said, Aristotle wrote, Socrates thought. But they don't tell you. Those same Greeks took pilgrimages like humble students to sit at the feet of Nile Valley masters. They don't tell you Pythagoras studied in Kemet for years, then walked out acting like he discovered what our builders had been using to raise pyramids that still laugh at time. They don't tell you Herodotus, the so-called father of history, stood in Africa and admitted with his own pen that Greece learned from Egypt. They don't tell you how Europe later put on a white wig, slapped its name on African blueprints, and rebranded the whole thing as the Enlightenment. Enlightenment? Brother, sister, we lit the first lamps. We carved light into stone. We painted time on temple walls. Europe dressed in stolen robes. Africa stood there naked in the textbooks. They framed it like Europe, thinkers, Africa, labor, Europe, mind, Africa, muscle, Europe, civilization, Africa, tribe. But here's the truth they keep buried. When Greece wanted wisdom, they went south. When Rome wanted culture, they went east. When Europe wanted power, they went to Africa. They came with notebooks and questions first, then cannons and crosses later. They studied from us, then erased us from the story. They drank from our well, then called it their river. They say Greek philosophy. I say African memory in a Greek accent. They say Greek mathematics. I say Nile Valley equations with European signatures, scribbled at the bottom. They say Greek medicine. I say Imhotep's shadow walking through their clinics. Understand this, we are not inspired by them. They were instructed by us. They weren't the beginning. They were the remix, the sample, the bootleg copy. We were the original cut, the master recording, the root system under their marble gardens. Europe built a mirror and called its reflection the world. Africa was the face behind the glass. And now the mirror is cracking. Because once you know that the same people they painted as primitive were running universities before Europe had nations, were measuring the earth before Europe had maps, were writing in ink while Europe was still carving in the dark. You stop walking with your head down. You realize they didn't discover brilliance. They visited it, they borrowed it, they rebranded it, and now we're repossessing it. They had the stage, we had the script. They took our lines, sold them back to us with an accent, and called it classics. This time, we're not just taking our lines back, we're taking the whole theater. Curtains up, truth on. Let the world see where the light really came from. They didn't just wake up enlightened in Athens, fam. Nah, they took a boat ride to the source, to Kemet, to the Nile, to the Black Land, where the sun-kissed skin and knowledge was older than their language. Let's stop pretending. Before Greek philosophy had a name, African priests were already mapping the stars, weighing the heart against the feather, breaking down the science of the soul while Europe was still trying to figure out how not to freeze through winter. They came as students. Let's be clear on that. Pythagoras, student. He sat at the feet of African masters and learned that triangle game from builders who'd been stacking stone into sky codes for thousands of years. Plato, student. He walked through temples where the walls were libraries, where every inch of stone was a page of a book Europe never wrote. Herodotus, student and storyteller. He walked the streets of Kemet wide-eyed, notebook in hand, documenting what he saw, then went home, and his people turned his travel blog into history. Let's talk contrast. Africa was running universities inside temples with entrance exams of character and discipline, while Europe was still arguing with thunder and rain, calling it gods because they didn't understand the science. Africa was doing brain surgery, setting broken bones, calculating the flooding of the Nile with a precision that would make NASA blush, while Europe was still throwing people into forests and caves and calling it fate. Africa was writing in stone what Europe would later scribble on paper and claim as revelation. See, when the Greeks came south, they didn't walk into darkness and bring light. They walked into light and brought it back north, wearing their own name tags. They took our mysteries, our math, our medicine, our metaphysics, our stories of creation, our concept of the soul's journey, and when they translated it, they edited us out. That's the real theft, not just the knowledge they carried home, but the silence they wrapped us in after. They turned Tahuti into Thoth, Auset into Isis, Heru into Horus, gave them Greek accents, and then told the world these were their ideas, their myths, their gods. Walk with me. Europe, cold stone, new to the game, still trying on civilization like a fresh suit. Africa, old soul, seasoned, already wrote the script on how to build a nation, how to balance spirit and state, how to live in rhythm with the cosmos. Yet in the textbooks, Europe is the father of philosophy, and Africa is the background scenery. Lies dressed in Latin. They say Western civilization, like it was born in a vacuum, like it didn't drink from the Nile, like it didn't sit in African classrooms and copy from the chalkboard of the ancients. You can't call it Greek wisdom when the Greeks had to cross the sea to get it. You can't crown Athens as the cradle when the midwife was Kemet. They studied under black teachers, then erased the teachers, kept the lessons, and wrote their own names on the front of the book. That's not genius, that's branding. And the world bought it. They built marble statues of men who learned from black minds and told you those were the first thinkers, the first scientists, the first philosophers. Meanwhile, our ancestors' faces were chipped off temple walls, noses broken, skin tones bleached in the retelling, until the world forgot that the Nile flowed through black hands. Europe dressed up in borrowed robes and called it a renaissance. Africa had already done it, lived it, mastered it, and moved on. But here's the twist. No matter how hard they try to bury the source, the river remembers. The stone remembers. The language under the language remembers. And now, we're remembering too. This isn't about hating Greece, it's about crediting Africa. It's about balance, about receipts, because you don't get to build a throne on stolen blueprints and then tell the world the architect was never black. Nah, curtains were closed, lights were dimmed, names were changed. But now, we're pulling the records out the vault. We're saying the quiet part like a drumbeat. They learned from us. They took from us. They built on us. And the world will know. Before Europe ever called itself enlightened, Africa was the sun. They call it Greek philosophy, like wisdom just popped up in Athens fully grown. No mother, no father, no roots in the Nile. But let's talk plain. Before Plato was posing questions, our priests were mapping the stars. Before Aristotle was cataloging life, our scribes were carving medicine into stone. Before Pythagoras was whispering about triangles, Our architects were aligning pyramids with the heartbeat of the cosmos. Europe wrote the story like they woke up one morning enlightened, like the light just chose them. But that light? It was Africa's reflection bouncing off stolen mirrors. They sailed down to Kemet as students, left as masters, then turned around and called us primitive. Imagine that. You teach a man to read the sky. He goes home, opens a school, names the constellations after his cousins, then says you never knew the stars. That's what they did. They walked through our libraries in Kemet, eyes wide like children in a candy store. Geometry, medicine, law, spirit, engineering, scrolls on scrolls, knowledge stacked higher than their tallest myths. They studied under African priests, African scientists, African builders of worlds. Then centuries later, they dressed it all up in togas and called it Western civilization. Europe loves to say, we gave the world reason. We gave the world science. We gave the world philosophy. No, you repackaged the Nile and slapped your name on the bottle. While Europe was still arguing with the dark, Africa was measuring the distance between the sun and the soul. While Europe was fearing eclipses, Africa was predicting them. While Europe was praying to survive winter, Africa was organizing calendars down to the flood of the river, the tilt of the earth, the breath of the seasons. They painted us as shadows, yet every time they wanted light, they came south. Understand this. Europe is the remix. Africa is the original track. They took our math, put a Greek accent on it. They took our medicine, put a Latin label on it. They took our gods, changed their names, and called it mythology when it was ours, classics when it was theirs. Look at the pattern. When Africa speaks, the world ignores. When Europe repeats Africa, the world applauds. They say Socrates said him, but don't mention the African temples he sat in. They say Plato taught, but skip the part where Egypt was his classroom. They say Hippocrates, father of medicine, but our surgeons were stitching flesh, resetting bones, documenting procedures, while his homeland was still wondering if sickness was a curse from the gods. They don't want to admit that the cradle of their genius was our house. They broke into the library of a civilization, photocopied the pages, then burned the originals and called themselves authors. But here's the twist. Truth doesn't stay buried. You can erase a name from a book, but you can't erase the fingerprints on the knowledge. And when you dust the surface, when you really look, you see it. The African imprint under every Western achievement. Europe was a student. Africa was the teacher. Europe was the echo. Africa was the voice. Europe was the candle. Africa was the sun. And no matter how loud they shout their version, the Nile still runs through history, whispering the real story. They love to start the story in Athens, like wisdom was born in a marble temple, wearing a toga and speaking Greek. But let's rewind the tape. Let's follow the footprints in the sand. Before Plato was deep, Kemet had already mapped the heavens, measured the earth, studied the soul, and written it all in stone. Before Pythagoras discovered triangles, African builders were lining up pyramids with the stars like it was second nature. You can't stack 2.3 million stones into a perfect cosmic compass by guessing. Before Hippocrates became the father of medicine, there were African doctors in white linen, performing surgery, writing medical texts, and understanding the body like it was a sacred drum. He studied in Egypt, then they turned his homework into his genius. Europe was the student who copied the answers, then erased the name at the top. Africa was the teacher who wrote the test, built the school, and lit the hallway. They took notes in Kemet, then went home and called it Greek philosophy. They sat at the feet of black scribes, then painted them beige in the history books. Herodotus walked through Egypt with his mouth wide open, writing about a people with woolly hair and burnt skin, calling Kemet the gift of the Nile. He knew what it was. They all did. But somewhere between the scrolls and the syllabus, Africa got edited out, and Europe stepped in like, we did that, we thought that, we built that. Nah, let's be clear. Europe was the echo. Africa was the voice. Europe was the borrowed light. Africa was the eternal flame. They learned geometry from Nile Valley architects, then acted like math was born in a white robe. They learned spirituality from African temples, then rebranded it as mystery schools and esoteric wisdom. They learned statecraft from pharaohs, then crowned themselves civilized while calling the source primitive. That's the con. They didn't just study Africa, they strip-mined it for gold, for bodies, for ideas, for glory. They took the land, took the labor, took the language, then buried the receipts. But the stones still remember, the temples still remember, the stars still line up over Giza and snitch on the lies. Europe was the rumor, Africa was the proof. They built museums full of stolen gods, staring down at the thieves with stone-cold African faces as if to say, "You can move me from my home, but you can't move the truth from time." So when they talk about Western civilization, understand the code. They're standing on African shoulders, wearing African knowledge draped in African science, but calling it universal so they don't have to say our name. Say it anyway. Kemet, Nubia, Kush, the Nile Valley, black soil, black hands, black minds. Europe was the candle, Africa was the sun, and every time they try to dim it, the light leaks out of history's cracks, whispering, "We taught them, they copied us, they buried us, but we're still here," because no matter how many statues they chisel, how many books they rewrite, how many lies they stack on top of the truth, the Nile remembers its source, and so do we. Europe got the microphone, but Africa built the stage. Let's talk about it. They tell you civilization began in Greece, like the world just woke up one day in Athens and said, "Let there be philosophy, please." Before a single Greek ever carved a column, Kemet was already writing in stone, mapping the stars, splitting seasons by the flood of the Nile, performing surgery while Europe was still trying to figure out which plants wouldn't erase them in their sleep. Understand the order of things. Before Plato was a thinker, priests in Egypt were astronomers, architects, healers, mathematicians, all in one robe. Before Pythagoras had a theorem, Africans were aligning pyramids with Orion so precise you'd think the sky was following them. Europe came to the Nile like a student, left like a thief, then returned to the world as a master. They studied in our temples, sat at the feet of black teachers, copied our scrolls, then turned around and called it Greek philosophy, Western science, European genius. No, family. That's African memory wearing a white mask. They visited the universities of Kemet, yes, universities long before Oxford, long before Sorbonne, where the entrance exam wasn't a piece of paper, it was your spirit, your discipline, your years of study. You didn't just major in something, you were initiated into it. Europe came with questions, Africa already had systems. Contrast this. In Africa, knowledge was sacred, tied to spirit, tied to land, measured in how well you served your people. In Europe, knowledge became a trophy, measured in how well you impressed other men in marble halls and dusty rooms. In Africa, we built schools inside temples because learning was worship. In Europe, they built schools inside empires because learning was power. See the difference? They walk through our libraries in Alexandria, eyes wide, hearts hungry, copying, translating, absorbing geometry, medicine, architecture, philosophy, spirituality. Then later, when Rome burned and Europe fell into its own darkness, they buried the ladder they climbed. They erased the African rungs, left only Greek fingerprints. So now they say Euclid founded geometry, but Euclid studied in Kemet. They say Pythagoras discovered the triangle, but Pythagoras was a student of Egyptian priests who'd been measuring land and building pyramids with those ratios for centuries. They say Hippocrates is the father of medicine. Meanwhile, The Ebers papyrus was already listing hundreds of treatments, surgeries, and diagnoses while his ancestors were still arguing with the weather. Europe likes to act like the origin story. Africa is the origin story. They turned our temples into mystery schools, our science into myths, our wisdom into legends, our gods into symbols, then rebranded the whole thing as Western thought. But listen, you can repaint the walls, you can rename the rooms, you can swap out the faces in the portraits. The foundation still remembers who laid the first brick. The Nile remembers. The stones remember. And deep down, so do they. That's why they fight so hard to keep Africa out of the frame. Because if the world ever truly accepts that the same people they called primitive, tribal, savage, once taught Europe how to think, how to count, how to heal, how to build, their whole house of superiority starts to crack. Europe built its pride on a foundation it did not create. Africa built the foundation, then watched in silence while the tenant tried to claim ownership of the land. But the deed is written in melanin, in pyramids, in papyrus, in the DNA of every child of the sun. They stole from the Nile, but the Nile still flows. They learned from black teachers, then painted them white in the retelling. They drank from African wells, then said the water came from the west. Yet here we stand, turning the lights back on, pulling the curtains, exposing the stage. Europe was the student, Africa was the school. And class is back in session. You ever notice how the story always starts in Greece? Aristotle this, Plato that, Socrates said. Like wisdom just fell out the sky and landed in Europe with a toga on. Nah, let's rewind the tape. Let's roll the real credits. Because before Greece was even walking straight, Africa was running empires. Before they had philosophy, we had temples. Before they had mythology, we had memory. Let's talk Egypt, Kemet, Black Land, land of the Nile, not the lie. While Europe was still trying to figure out how to bathe once a week, we were aligning pyramids with the stars like we had the universe on speed dial. While they were worshipping thunder because it was loud, we were charting the movement of planets, mapping the afterlife, measuring the soul. But when the Greeks pulled up, they knew. They knew exactly where the light was. They came to Africa like students and left like authors, came as apprentices, left as founders. Pythagoras didn't dream that triangle in his sleep. He studied in Egyptian temples for years, learning geometry from priests who'd been measuring the Nile since his ancestors were still chasing goats. Plato didn't just imagine higher forms. He sat at the feet of African teachers, listened to wisdom carved in stone, then went home and gave it a Greek accent. Herodotus? That man wrote whole chapters about Egypt, called it the mother of civilization. Then Europe read his book, closed it, and pretended they didn't see the word Africa on the birth certificate. They turned field trips into origin stories, turned study abroad into we invented this, turned we learned into we created. They walked through our libraries, then later said, we discovered reason. They stood under ceilings painted with stars and gods and cosmic laws, then ran back to Europe like, look what we came up with. No, my friend, you didn't come up with it. You came and took from it. Let's be clear. Europe is the remix. Africa is the original track. Europe is the student who copied the homework, then told the teacher they worked all night. Africa is the one who wrote the formulas, built the tools, tested the theories on stone, on sand, on spirit. But when power changed hands, so did the story. They erased names off walls. They buried noses off statues. They called our gods myths, and their myths theology. They called our science mystery, and their mystery science. See how that works? They took Imhotep, the African genius, architect, physician, philosopher, man so cold they turned him into a god after he died. And Europe said, let's call Hippocrates the father of medicine instead. They took Ma'at, truth, balance, order, justice, and broke it into little pieces, then rebranded it as ethics, law, philosophy, as if those weren't born together in one African word, one African principle, one African heartbeat. This is the part they don't teach you. They teach you Greece as the dawn, when it was really the reflection. They teach you Athens as the light, when it was a candle lit from an African sun. Understand, when Greeks came to Egypt, they didn't walk into darkness. They walked into a university carved in stone. They walked into libraries older than their language. They walked into a civilization so advanced they thought it was magic. But it wasn't magic. It was Africa. Now look at the contrast. Europe, cold stone, short seasons, survival mode, conquer or be conquered, hoard or be hungry, philosophy, born from scarcity and fear. Africa, river flowing, sun blazing, soil singing, time to observe, to think, to build. Philosophy born from abundance and rhythm. One world obsessed with control, the other obsessed with balance. So when Europe took from Africa, it didn't just borrow knowledge, it stripped the soul out of it. They took astronomy, left the spirituality, took math, left the meaning, took medicine, left the rituals of respect for the body, took symbols, left the story. Then they fed us the leftovers and called it Western civilization. But Africa was the school. And class is not just back in session. Class is exposing the syllabus. We're naming names, we're tracing lines, we're pulling receipts out the sarcophagus, because the point is not to hate Greece. The point is to stop erasing Kemet. You can't talk Plato without talking the Nile. You can't praise Pythagoras and ignore the priests who taught him. You can't worship Western thought while stepping over the African roots it grew from. You want real history? Then say it plain. Greece was a student. Africa was the teacher, and now the teacher is awake. The chalk is in our hand. The board is clean. Next lesson, we're going to talk about how they didn't just take our knowledge. They tried to rebrand our gods, rewrite our timelines, and redesign our image. Turn the page. Stay seated. This is where it gets even louder. Turn the page? Nah. Rip it out. We're not reading anymore. We're revealing. Stay seated. This is where the marble starts cracking. This is where the statues start confessing. They told you Greece is the cradle of Western civilization. Cute. But they forgot to mention that cradle was rocked by African hands. They gave you Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras like they fell out the sky, fully formed, heads full of genius, souls full of reason. But they never told you about the passports, about the trips, about those long pilgrimages down into Kemet, what the world now calls Egypt, where the Nile was a university and the temples were textbooks written in stone. Listen close. Before Europe had philosophy, Africa had ma'at, truth, balance, order, justice, not as a theory, as a way of breathing. Before Europe had geometry, Africa was measuring the earth, mapping the stars, aligning pyramids with Orion like it was light work. Before Europe had medicine, Africa was doing brain surgery, stitching skulls, understanding the pulse of the body and the rhythm of the spirit. You think Greece just woke up one morning and invented thinking? Nah. They went to the source. They studied under black priests, black scribes, black astronomers, black builders who had already been practicing science for thousands of years before Greece even knew its own name. Herodotus, Greek, came to Kemet, saw the temples, saw the people, saw the knowledge, wrote it down, told you they were dark-skinned, wool-haired, told you the Nile birthed it all. They read his words in universities, then pretend they never saw that part. Pythagoras, they say he discovered the theorem, fam. Those triangles were carved into African walls before his grandparents' ever walked the earth. He studied in Kemet for years, then walked back to Greece like a man carrying stolen fire, and the world clapped for him. Plato, student of those who studied in Kemet. Aristotle, student of the students who drank from African wells, then built European fountains and called them original. See the pattern? Europe shows up late to the party, copies the answers, then erases the kids who wrote them. Africa opens the doors, teaches the world, then gets written out the story. They told you Africa was primitive while standing on African math. They told you Africa was mystical while using African medicine. They told you Africa was backward while reading African philosophy with a Greek accent. That's not history. That's robbery with a chalkboard. Understand the game. First, they study you, then they copy you, then they rename what you made, then they erase you from it. Europe called that progress. We call it what it is: theft, dressed up in a toga. Look at the contrast. Africa, built in stone, aligned with the cosmos, thinking in centuries, speaking in pyramids. Europe, built in myth, rewrote the credits, thinking in conquests, speaking in footnotes. Africa, let's preserve the body, honor the soul, document the journey. Europe, let's raid the tombs, steal the gold, ship the mummies, sell the story back to you with a museum ticket. They stand in front of African statues, nose broken off, skin lightened by time and lies, and say, "These are ours. These are part of Western heritage." No, my friend, these are receipts. Receipts of who taught who. Receipts of who had knowledge when others were just learning how to spell civilization. You were taught Greece gave us philosophy. But Africa was already asking, what is the soul? What is justice? What is the purpose of a life well lived? And not just asking, living it, codifying it, weaving it into law, ritual, and daily bread. You were taught Greece gave us science. But Africa was already charting the heavens, tracking Sirius, mapping the flood cycles of the Nile, using math not for bragging rights, but for feeding people, for building stable societies, for aligning life with the universe. You were taught Greece gave us medicine, but Africa was already writing medical texts, diagnosing diseases using surgery, herbs, and procedures that would make a medieval European doctor look like a child with a wooden spoon. They flipped it on you. The student became the master on paper. The master became the mystery in the footnotes. And every time you say Western thought without saying African roots, you help them bury the truth one more inch. This is not about hating Europe. This is about balance, about ma'at, about putting the sun back where it belongs in the sky. Because when you think genius is white and ancient Greek, you look at a black child and see potential at best, never inheritance. You see them as trying to catch up to a race they actually started. When you realize Greece learned from Kemet, the whole script flips. You stop asking, can Africa ever rise? And start asking, how did Africa get pushed down after lifting everybody else up? That's the question they don't want you to ask, because the answer leads you from temples and scrolls to ships and chains, from classrooms in Kemet to plantations in the Americas. But don't rush. We're not done here. Let this sink in. The same system that crowned Greek thinkers while hiding African teachers is the same system that crowns European discoverers while hiding African navigators, crowns European explorers while hiding African empires, crowns European scientists while hiding African innovators. Different chapter, same pen, same lie. So when they say, be grateful for Western civilization, understand you're the co-author. They left off the cover. Turn the page? No, we're flipping the whole book. Stay seated. This is where the temples start talking. This is where the Nile testifies. This is where the stolen syllabus gets returned to sender. And after we're done with Greece, we're going to walk you through how they tried to bury the mother continent under marble, myths, and museum glass. Stay with me. The volume's still rising. They told you civilization was born in a white marble cradle. They lied. The cradle was carved in the Nile and Europe came to drink. Let's talk about it. Before Greece had a name that echoed through textbooks, Kemet was already writing history in stone. Before Plato thought deeply, African priests were mapping the stars, measuring the earth, tracking time with temples that lined up with the sun like they had a contract with the cosmos. Europe had myths. Africa had measurements. They say Greek philosophy, Greek science, Greek math. I say follow the footprints. Pythagoras didn't wake up one morning and suddenly hear triangles whispering secrets in his ears. The man studied in Egypt. He walked into black temples where geometry wasn't a classroom subject. It was sacred language. They used it to raise pyramids, not multiple choice answers. Europe turned it into theorems. Africa turned it into monuments. Plato, he wasn't just sitting in Athens daydreaming about ideal forms. He went to Kemet too, sat at the feet of African high priests, listened to wisdom older than his entire homeland, then went back and repackaged it as Greek philosophy. Europe wrote dialogues. Africa lived principles. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, stepped into Egypt and had to admit these people were ancient when Greece was still in diapers. He saw the temples, the math, the medicine, the order, the culture, the black faces. He wrote it down. They read it in Europe, then acted brand new. They turned eyewitness testimony into background noise, turned African teachers into mysterious influences. Nah, name it right. Those weren't influences. Those were instructors. The Greeks came to Africa like students, left like authors, and Europe gave them full credit for a stolen curriculum. Understand this. When you see Socrates asking questions, you're seeing an echo of Nile Valley initiation, where you questioned yourself before you spoke to the gods. When you see Greek doctors discovering medicine, you're seeing a late remix of Imhotep, the African genius who was diagnosing, treating, performing surgery centuries before Hippocrates signed his first oath. Europe put his name in lights. Africa's name got cut from the credits. They tell you Greece is the birthplace of democracy, but Kemet had councils, order, law, pharaohs bound by ma'at, truth, balance, justice, while Europe was still trying to wash the mud off its feet. Europe built cities, Africa built civilizations. They love to show you white statues, smooth faces, broken noses, and tell you, this is the standard of beauty. This is the height of thought. But look closer. Why the broken noses on African statues in European museums? Why the repainting, the rebranding? These people weren't really black stories. Because if they admit that the foundation of their Western civilization was poured by black hands, their whole superiority costume starts unraveling at the seams. So they buried the mother continent under marble and mythology. They told you the Nile was just a river, not a library. They told you Africa was primitive while studying from African textbooks written in stone and starlight. Europe wrote the script. Africa wrote the code. They gave you Zeus, Athena, Apollo, gods with European faces and African ideas. They took our science, wrapped it in their stories, and called it classics. You were taught to worship the students and ignore the teachers. So now, when you hear Greek philosophy, Greek science, Greek art, I want you to hear the echo behind it. African roots, African minds, African mastery. This isn't about hating Greece, let's be clear. This is about correcting the record, giving honor back to the source. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Europe was the apprentice. Africa was the architect. And the next time someone tells you everything started in Europe, you look them in the eye and say, student, stop pretending you're the teacher. We're not done. Next, we're going to peel back how museums became crime scenes with gift shops, how universities turned theft into curriculum, and how the mother continent was edited out of her own story. Stay close. We're about to turn the volume all the way up. Let's talk about Greece. Not the postcard, not the myth, the marketing. Because somewhere along the line, the world got sold a story that goes like this. Civilization was born in Europe. Philosophy, Greece. Science, Greece. Math, Greece. Democracy, Greece. Africa. Pyramids and poverty. Maybe some drums. That's not a mistake. That's a strategy. See, before Europe was wearing togas in the sun, Africa was already writing in stone, measuring the stars, mapping the Nile, building monuments so precise they still confuse computers. While Europe was praying for the rain to come, Africa was measuring the flood cycles of the Nile down to the season, down to the day. While Europe was arguing over which god was in charge, Africa had already charted the path of the sun, timed the solstices, aligned temples with the cosmos, like they had a direct line to the universe. While Europe was scared of the dark, Africa was studying it. But then, here comes Greece, fresh out of the shadows, walking into Kemet like a student and walking out like a professor. They sat at the feet of African priests, scribes, architects, healers. They learned medicine in temples where black hands had been stitching bodies and spirits back together for centuries. They learned geometry from people who carved equations into pyramids before Pythagoras was even a thought. They studied philosophy from elders who didn't just debate ideas, they lived them. Ma'at, balance, order, truth, not as theory, but as law. Then Greece took notes, gave those notes European names, and the world started calling it Western civilization. Let's put it plain, Africa built the house. Greece walked through the front door, took pictures of the furniture, renamed the rooms, and Europe started charging admission. Africa created the blueprint, Greece traced it, Europe copyrighted it, Africa birthed the knowledge, Greece borrowed the baby, Europe claimed the custody papers. They'll tell you Pythagoras discovered the theorem. Discovered? Brother walked into a continent where land was measured with rope and ratio since before his grandfather's grandfather, then went home and said, "Look what I found." They'll say, Plato studied forms, ideals, the soul. Where do you think he got that from? He wasn't just chilling in Athens staring at the sky. He went to Kemet, sat in temples where black sages had been breaking down the nature of the spirit long before Greek had a word for philosophy. They'll say, Hippocrates, father of medicine. Meanwhile, Imhotep was diagnosing, documenting, performing surgeries when the Greek language was still learning to crawl. But his name doesn't get the spotlight. It gets buried in footnotes if mentioned at all. Europe versus Africa. Let's draw the line. Europe sells enlightenment. Africa was the light. Europe sells renaissance. Africa never died to be reborn. Europe sells classics. Africa is the original text. Europe sells mythology. Africa lived the science behind the symbol. But here's the trick. They didn't just borrow. They rewrote the receipts. They turned African temples into mystery schools like our ancestors were some secret club instead of the world's first universities. They turned African teachers into influences like they were just side characters in a Greek hero's journey. They turned African wisdom into esoteric knowledge, hidden, mystical, fringe, while Greek versions became standard curriculum. They took black brilliance, put a white mask on it, and told the world, this is where it began. And Europe built a whole identity off that remix. Greece became the cradle of civilization. Africa became a backdrop, a location, a setting, never the author. They praised Athens but never mentioned the African libraries that fed it. They worshipped the Parthenon but never told you who taught them how to line stone with the stars. They crowned Socrates, Plato, Aristotle as the holy trinity of thought, but never admitted those minds were sharpened on African whetstones. Understand this. When you erase the African roots of Greek thought, you're not just lying about history, you're weaponizing it. Because if Europe is the source, then Europe gets to be the standard, the teacher, the judge, the reference point. And Africa gets cast as the student, the developing, the emerging, the one always catching up. That's not an accident. That's architecture. But the funny thing about truth, it doesn't stay buried forever. You can rename the chapters, but the ink remembers. You can repaint the statues, but the nose tells on you. You can lock the scrolls in museums, but the ancestors still whisper through the cracks, and right now those whispers are turning into a chorus. Because once you know that Greece learned from Kemet, the whole Western story starts to wobble. Once you see that Europe's genius stood on African shoulders, you stop being impressed by the costume and start looking for the tailor. This is why they keep Africa in the shadows. Because if the world ever really understood who taught who built what, who lit the first torch, the hierarchy would flip. The arrogance would crumble. The West would have to admit it's not the beginning, it's a remix. And the mother continent, she's not a side note, she's the opening line. Stay with me. Next, we're going to step into those marble halls where Europe keeps its trophies, museums, universities, and centers of civilization. And we're going to call them what they are: crime scenes with catalogs, lecture halls built on looted libraries, curriculums crafted to keep you worshiping the student and forgetting the teacher. We're not just telling history, we're restoring memory. And once memory comes back, the whole world map looks different. Because here's the part your textbook skipped. Europe didn't wake up one day and become civilized. It took a field trip. Those marble statues they brag about, those great minds they worship, most of them were students, sitting cross-legged at the feet of black teachers by the Nile. Let's talk plain. Before Greece had philosophers, Africa had libraries carved in stone. Before Plato wrote a word, Kemet had already written entire civilizations in pyramid form, star-aligned, math-perfect, spirit-engineered. Europe was still trying to figure out how to bathe consistently. Africa was mapping the stars, measuring the Earth's circumference, performing surgery, charting the soul. They call it Greek philosophy. We call it African memory with a white label slapped on the front. Pythagoras, that triangle you learned in school. A2 plus B2, C2, like it dropped out the sky. That brother studied in Kemet for years. He didn't discover that formula. He picked it up from black minds who'd been building with it for ages. Europe wrote his name in bold. Africa's name was erased in the footnotes. Plato, he wasn't just thinking deep under an olive tree. He went to Kemet too, sat in temples where priests broke down the science of the soul, the structure of reality, the laws of Ma'at, truth, balance, order, justice. Then he came back home, changed the names, and they called it the Republic. Aristotle, they call him the father of Western philosophy. But how you a father when you're reading someone else's family album? History whispers that he studied in Egypt and that his wisdom came from libraries his people later helped plunder. Imagine copying a whole test, then calling yourself the teacher. Europe versus Africa? Let's draw the line. Europe built statues of thinking men. Africa built entire cities as thoughts made solid. Europe wrote theories on paper. Africa wrote them in stone, in stars, in social order. Europe debated if the soul was real. Africa had initiation in schools that walked you through your own spirit, step by step, gate by gate. But here's the con. When Europe finally got a taste of African knowledge, it didn't say, "We learned from them." It said, "We are the beginning." They turned, "We studied under Africans," into, "We gave the world civilization." That's not ignorance. That's strategy. Because if the world ever remembered that black people taught the very ones who later called us primitive, the whole lie collapses. The West stops looking like the hero and starts looking like the student who stole the teacher's notes, then buried the teacher. They told you Africa was dark. But how is Africa dark when all the so-called enlightenment came from stolen African fire? Let's be specific. Geometry? Kemet used it to remeasure land after the Nile flooded. That's how you get geometry, earth measurement. Astronomy? Africans weren't just looking at stars, they were timing harvests. building calendars, lining up monuments with Orion and Sirius, while Europe still thought thunder was just angry gods. Medicine, the Ebers Papyrus, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, ancient African medical texts with surgery, trauma care, diagnostics. That's centuries before Hippocrates, yet they call him the father of medicine. He studied in Kemet too, by the way. Europe versus Africa, Europe. We think, therefore we are. Africa. We are, therefore we know. One is insecure, trying to prove existence through thought. The other is rooted. Knowing existence births thought. So when they say Greek myths, understand, some of those myths are twisted African stories, remixed, renamed, and sold back to the world. When they say Greek gods, look at the roots, Zeus, Athena, Dionysus. You'll find echoes of older African deities with the melanin scrubbed out. They teach your children that civilization rose in Europe, that history started in Greece, like the Nile flows backward, like the sun rises in the west. But we're restoring memory. And once memory comes back, you see it clear. Greece was a student. Africa was the university. Europe was the echo. Africa was the voice. They built a whole West on stolen syllables. Now the original tongue is waking up. Because the moment you realize that the same people they called savages taught the people they called geniuses, the whole script starts to burn. And that's what they fear, not just that Africa was first, but that Africa was teacher. Stay tuned, we're not done yet. Next, we talk about how they didn't just borrow the knowledge, they buried the source. First, they sat at the feet of Africa, then they stood up, walked out, and pretended they taught themselves. Let's talk about that burial. Europe loves to act like it woke up one morning and discovered philosophy, science, mathematics, like some divine download from the sky. Nah, those ideas were already old by the time Greece even learned to hold a pen right. While Europe was still figuring out how to bathe regularly, Africa had libraries carved in stone, temples that doubled as universities, priests who were scientists, farmers who were engineers. Kemet, ancient Egypt, wasn't just a kingdom. It was the motherboard, the main server, the source code. But here's how the trick went down. They came as students. They left as founders. They studied under black priests, then turned around and called them mystic pagans. They learned geometry from the Nile, then told the world it was born in Athens. They watched African surgeons work, then wrote European names over the textbooks. They took the blueprint, scratched off the logo, and rebranded it Western civilization. That's not borrowing, that's identity theft. See, Europe writes history like a thief writes an alibi, leaves out the part where they got the goods. They'll tell you about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but skip the chapter where those men went south to study with African masters. They'll praise Greek philosophy, but won't mention that Greece called Egypt the land of the wise, the mother of knowledge. They'll celebrate Hippocrates, father of medicine, while African healers had been stitching wounds, setting bones, and performing surgeries when his ancestors were still praying to the wind. They'll say Pythagoras' theorem, like the Nile never flooded, like African builders never measured land and raised pyramids so precise you still can't slide a blade between the stones. That's the burial, not just of a people, but of the credit. Europe versus Africa, let's draw that line clear. Europe built statues to celebrate thinkers. Africa built civilizations out of the thinking. Europe wrote books about the stars. Africa aligned whole cities with them. Europe turned wisdom into debate. Africa turned wisdom into culture, law, architecture, spirit, life. Europe said, "We are the cradle of civilization." Africa smiled like an old grandmother watching a child brag about cooking with recipes she wrote. Understand this. They didn't just erase names, they erased faces, skin tones, languages. Gods with broad noses and full lips got repainted into pale marble fantasies. They turned black pharaohs into tan movie characters, turned Nubian queens into side notes and footnotes, turned African genius into mystery. They knew what they were doing, because once you bury the source, you control the story. And once you control the story, you control the minds. But here's the part they didn't plan for. Truth is stubborn. It doesn't stay buried. You can whitewash the paintings, but you can't change the sun that painted us. You can rename the knowledge, but you can't rewrite the soil it grew from. Every time someone asks, how did they build the pyramids? Africa grins. Because the question itself is proof that the world still feels the echo of our genius. So no, Greece didn't create civilization. It studied at Africa's university, photocopied the notes, and then locked the originals in a basement. But the basement door is cracking, the dust is clearing, the receipts are resurfacing in stone, in script, in DNA, in memory. And we're here to say it plain. If Greece is the student, Africa is the teacher. If Europe is the remix, Africa is the original track. They didn't just borrow the knowledge, they buried the source. But the ground is shaking now, and what they tried to hide is starting to rise. Stay with me. Next, we'll talk about how that burial wasn't just about history. It was about power, and what happens when the children of the source finally remember who they are. Power. Yeah, let's talk about that, because this ain't just about dates in a dusty book or statues with broken noses. This is about who gets to stand in the spotlight and who gets hidden in the shadows. Europe wrote itself as the main character. Africa got pushed into the background like an extra with no lines. But here's the twist. Before Europe was even walking steady, Africa was running galaxies in its mind. Let's name it plain. The Greeks, they took a field trip to Kemet and came back acting like they invented the tour. They sat at the feet of African priests, scribes, astronomers, healers, architects, and learned geometry. They saw it in the way pyramids kissed the sky. Philosophy, they heard it in temple walls that spoke in stone. Medicine, they watched surgeries done with herbs, with precision, with spirit. Then they went home, put their own names on the cover, and the world started calling them the fathers of civilization. Fathers? Of what? Of a story that already had grandparents old enough to remember when the Nile first learned how to flood on rhythm. Let's draw the line clear. Europe built libraries. Africa built the knowledge they filled them with. Europe wrote theories. Africa lived the science. Europe carved statues of African gods, gave them Greek names, and called it mythology. Africa carved principles into stone, aligned with the stars, and called it Ma'at, truth, balance, order. But when Europe told the story, they made it sound like Africa was somewhere in the dark waiting to be discovered. How you discover a place, teaching math while you still counting on your fingers. See, the theft wasn't just of land or gold, it was of memory. Erase the source, and the imitator looks original. Bury the teacher, and the student becomes genius. They turned African brilliance into mystery, turned African records into myths, turned African gods into symbols. But let a Greek say it, now it's philosophy, now it's science, now it's classic. Understand this, when they buried your history, they weren't just hiding the past, they were manufacturing the future. Because if you believe your people were always behind, you'll never question why you're still being kept behind. If you think Europe is the light and Africa is the shadow, you'll chase their reflection instead of standing in your own sun. But here's where it gets dangerous for them and beautiful for you. When the children of the source start remembering, the whole script starts shaking. Because once you realize that the Greeks studied under your ancestors, that Western thought is wearing African hand-me-downs, you stop walking into classrooms with your head bowed. You stop reading their books like they're holy and start reading them like they're partial, edited, redacted, remixed without credits. Europe versus Africa? Let's be real. Europe is the remix. Africa is the original sample. Europe is the museum. Africa is the civilization that filled it. Europe is the translation. Africa is the language. And when the language wakes up, the translation starts to stutter. So now the question isn't, did the Greeks learn from the Egyptians? We already know that. The question is, what happens when the descendants of those Egyptians, those Nubians, those Cushites, finally step back into the room, knowing this was ours, this is ours. We are not guests in civilization. We are the landlords. Stay locked in. Next, we're going to peel back how they kept the remix on repeat, through schools, churches, movies, museums, and how you break the loop once you remember you're not the afterthought. You're the blueprint. They told you civilization began in Greece, like Africa was late to its own party. Nah, let's set this scene right. Picture Kemet. Black soil, black stone, black genius. Before there was a place called Europe with a plan, Africa was already writing in stars, measuring the Nile with math so clean it still humbles satellites. While Europe was still figuring out how to bathe regular, your ancestors were mapping the heavens, aligning pyramids with Orion like it was light work. They call it Greek philosophy. Cool story, but ask them this. How did Greece go from tribe and turmoil to temples and timeless wisdom right after their boys took a field trip down the Nile? Here's how. They studied you. They sat at the feet of African priests, scribes, healers, astronomers, men and women who carried thousands of years of memory in their tongues. Pythagoras. He didn't wake up one day with triangles dancing in his dreams. He studied in Kemet. That Pythagorean theorem, those angles were already carved into pyramids long before he ever touched papyrus. Plato, Aristotle, they weren't just thinking deep. They were on a knowledge heist. They came to Africa like students, went back home like founders, and the world wrote it up like they had invented thought. They turned your grandmother's recipes into five-star cuisine, slapped their names on the menu, and then told you can't afford the restaurant. Contrast time. Africa was building libraries so large they looked like cities. Europe was burning books it didn't understand. Africa was teaching the science of the soul, balance of the body, harmony with the land. Europe was perfecting the science of the sword, the ship, the chain. Africa said, know thyself. Europe said, own something, own someone. Africa aligned temples with the sun to honor light. Europe built cathedrals on top of ruins to bury memory. And when Greece started shining, who funded that glow up? Your gold, your grain, your geometry, your medicine, your cosmology. They called it Western civilization. But the compass pointed south when they went searching for wisdom. See the trick? They took your scrolls, your symbols, your stories, translated them, washed the melanin out the margins, and re-released them as universal. They made Africa the dark continent on the map, while using African light to guide their ships, their clocks, their calendars, their universities. In their version, Greece is the genius, Rome is the muscle, Europe is the hero, Africa is the background. But in the real cut, Africa is the architect, the first teacher, the source code. They didn't just borrow. They built an empire off your intellectual credit and never paid the bill. And to keep the lie alive, they had to keep you from recognizing the mirror. So they turned your gods into their myths, your scientists into their mystics, your history into their influence. Influence? That's what they call it when the thief is still holding the bag. Understand this, the Greeks were students. The Egyptians, Africans, were the professors. The Greeks had curiosity. Africa had curriculum. The Greeks had questions. Africa had answers already etched in stone. So when they say, be grateful for Greek thought, you say, I honor the source, and the source was African. Once you see that, the whole Western story starts glitching. Because if Africa was the first classroom, the first lab, the first library, then you're not developing, you're remembering it. And that's dangerous to a system built on amnesia. Stay with me. Next, we're going to walk through how they kept you from tracing those Greek footsteps back to African temples, how they used schools, churches, movies, museums to keep your genius locked in their display cases. And then we'll talk about how you crack the glass, claim the knowledge, and step back into your role. Not as Europe's shadow, but as the sun they've been orbiting this whole time. First, let's clear the smoke. Because history been told like a bedtime story with the monsters edited out and the thieves dressed up as heroes. They say, Western civilization began with the Greeks. Nah. Western civilization began with the Greeks walking into Africa with notebooks open and mouths shut. Let's talk about it. Europe, back then, still trying to figure out how to bathe regular, still whispering to trees and thunder, still scared of the dark they couldn't explain. Africa, specifically Kemet, what they renamed Egypt, already running universities before university was a word, already measuring the stars while Europe was still staring at them in confusion, already mapping the soul while Europe was just trying not to freeze to death. You had temples that were textbooks, pyramids that were math problems solved in stone, libraries where priests were scientists and scientists were spiritual, no separation, just mastery. So when Greece pulled up, they didn't arrive like teachers, they arrived like students who later forged their own report card. Picture this, young Greeks crossing the Mediterranean, eyes wide, looking at black stone faces 30 feet high, asking, how long y'all been doing this? And Africa answered without bragging, 'cause when you are the sun, you don't argue with a flashlight. They came to Kemet to learn geometry, from the Nile's floods and fields, philosophy, from African priests breaking down my cat, truth, balance, order, while Europe was still arguing over whose god was louder. Medicine, from scrolls on how to repair bones, deliver babies, and calm the mind when the spirit got heavy. They came as guests, they left as authors. That's the hustle. They'll tell you, Thales, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, fathers of philosophy, fathers of science, fathers of reason. But ask them, who taught the fathers? They won't say, African high priests with shaved heads and deep eyes. They won't say temple schools in Waset, Thebes, in Unu, Heliopolis, where they studied for 20, 30 years before they could even speak on the mysteries. Pythagoras studied in Kemet for years, then went home with African math in his pocket, and they named the theorem after him. Plato sat at the feet of Nile Valley wisdom, then wrote Republic like he invented order and justice. Aristotle? His library was full of African scrolls, whole philosophies he didn't birth, just translated, trimmed, and tagged made in Greece. They turned stolen lecture notes into Western thought. Look at the contrast. Africa, built in harmony with the cosmos, stone aligned with stars, temples aligned with solstices, architecture as prayer, math as music, science as a form of worship. Europe built in reaction to fear, fear of nature, fear of the body, fear of the feminine, fear of the dark, outside and inside. Africa said, you are a piece of the universe, know yourself and you'll know the gods. Europe said, you are dirty, broken, sinful, obey or be erased. Africa raised minds. Europe raised empires. Africa taught balance. Europe taught conquest. Africa said, let's live in rhythm with the Nile. Europe said, let's own everything that moves. Now, here's the trick. When Greece got schooled by Africa, they didn't say, let's honor the source. They said, let's replace it. They took African gods, lightened the skin, changed the names, and called it mythology. They took African symbols, wiped off the melanin, and called it classical. They took African knowledge, put Greek signatures at the bottom, and called it original thought. And once Rome copied Greece and Europe copied Rome, you ended up with a whole civilization acting like it woke up genius one morning instead of being tutored by the Nile. Understand this, you are not the remix. You are the master track. They buried your name so they could crown themselves. They called your science magic, your doctors sorcerers, your philosophers priests, your engineers slaves. They couldn't say, we learned from black people, because then Europe's whole ego would crack like old marble. So they flipped the script. Africa became primitive. Greece became the beginning. And you became inspired by instead of originated from. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Walk into a museum in Europe, look at the statues with broken noses, sandstone skin still holding the sun, and ask yourself why the nose is always gone. What were they trying to erase? Walk into a university, hear them chant Greek names like a holy litany, and ask, where are the African footnotes? Where is Kemet in this curriculum? Turn on a movie, see ancient Egypt played by actors who'd sunburn in real Egyptian light, and ask, who are you trying to convince, me or yourselves? This is why they keep the remix on repeat, schools, churches, movies, museums, a loop of amnesia, because if you remember that Greece was the student and Africa was the teacher, the whole hierarchy flips. You stop begging to be included and start demanding to be recognized. You stop seeing yourself as developing and start seeing yourself as interrupted. You stop asking, can we catch up to Europe? And start asking, when is Europe going to acknowledge its debt? Stay with me. Next, we're going to walk into those institutions, the classrooms, the pulpits, the galleries, the screens, and expose how they keep the lie alive. Then we'll talk about what it looks like to reclaim the mic, rewrite the credits, and live like people who know they're not the sequel. You are not the footnote. You are the first chapter. And once you move like that, the whole world's curriculum has to change. First thing they did was flip the camera, turn the lens away from the Nile, and point it at the Aegean. Zoom in on marble statues, fade out on black stone temples. They said, civilization began in Greece. Like Africa was late to its own party. Like the Nile needed permission from the Mediterranean to start flowing. Listen, before a single Greek scratched a letter into stone, African hands had already mapped the stars, measured the earth, counted the heartbeat of the cosmos in cubits and constellations. But they don't teach you that. They teach you this: Plato the genius, Aristotle the mind, Pythagoras the math god, Homer the poet, Europe as the brain, Africa as the body, Europe as the thinker, Africa as the muscle. They draw the map so that the story runs northward. Knowledge flows from Greece to Rome to Europe to America, neatly skipping the Black River that fed it all. See, when Greece was still learning how to spell philosophy, African priests in Kemet were already running universities inside temples, not Sunday school. I'm talking multidiscipline, multi-thousand-year curriculum, math, medicine, law, astronomy, engineering, ethics, spiritual science, all braided together like cornrows of the cosmos. So how did Greece get it? They traveled, they studied, they sat at African feet, they walked through black libraries before they ever built their own. Herodotus told you he saw black faces in Kemet. He said the Egyptians were dark-skinned, wool-haired. He wrote it down. They just don't read you that part. Pythagoras, before he was a theorem, he was a student in Egyptian temples for 20 plus years. He didn't dream that triangle in a cave. He picked it up from walls and rituals older than his whole homeland. Plato, he sends his people to Kemet, then comes back talking about the soul, about the forms, about the eternal and the good, concepts that had already been carved into African stone for millennia. Aristotle walks into libraries stacked with black wisdom, copies, collects, repackages. Then Europe crowns him the father of logic. Father? of what your ancestors already mastered. This is how the theft works. They sit in your classroom, copy your notes, walk out, change the cover, put their name on your book, then return as experts on your culture. And when you protest, they say, prove it. But they already erased half the receipts, burned the libraries, renamed the gods, whitened the statues, sanded the noses off the sphinxes, then called it weathering. Weather don't erase noses and leave lips. That's not erosion. That's editing. They took black deities, wrapped them in new costumes, changed the accents, kept the powers, kept the stories, but switched the faces. Africa, source. Europe, remix. Africa, blueprint. Europe, renovation with stolen bricks. Africa, sun. Europe, mirror. But they trained you to worship the mirror, not the light. So they built schools that start history in Athens, not in Kush, not in Kemet, not in Nok, not in Aksum, not in Great Zimbabwe. They made Western civilization the main course and Africa a side dish you might order if you're feeling cultural. They gave you textbooks that show Africa as tribes and huts, Europe as towers and crowns. They gave you churches that painted angels with European faces and demons with African features. They gave you museums with African masks behind glass. No context, no timeline, no connection to the math, the medicine, the architecture those same people built. They gave you movies where Greece is glowing, Rome is shining, Africa is either jungle or desert, and the only time you see a black scholar is as a side character to a white discoverer. They built a whole universe where your genius is a rumor, and their version is the official record. Understand, Europe didn't just learn from Africa, it learned, then lied about the teacher. Imagine a student who copies your homework, gets an A, then tells the class you cheated off them. That's the relationship, but here's the twist. Even buried, the truth leaks. You read between the lines of Greek writers, you see them confessing, slipping up, admitting they went south to learn. You look at the timelines, you see African pyramids standing tall, long before Parthenons ever touched the sky. You study the symbols, you see Medu-Neter giving birth to Greek letters, African cosmology giving birth to Western philosophy. They will tell you, everyone borrows from everyone. No, borrowing is when you credit. Theft is when you hide the source and sell it back to the original owner. That's what happened to you. Your ancestors' libraries became Europe's Renaissance. Your temples became Europe's Enlightenment. Your science became Europe's discovery. And you got cast as the background extra in your own movie, but stay locked in, because now we're stepping past the lies, past the whitewashed marble, past the museum glass, and we're going to talk about how you crack this whole setup. How you stop being the erased author and become the loud signature across the bottom of history. Next, we're walking straight into their institutions, the schools, churches, movies, museums, and I'm going to show you exactly how they used each one to dim Africa and spotlight Europe. Then we'll talk about how you flip their stage lights, recenter the camera, and make the world say your ancestors' names with respect in every classroom on Earth. They told you the story backwards, like Africa was the footnote and Europe was the main text, like light was born in Athens and Egypt was just background decor. Nah, we're flipping that script back to its original setting. The Greeks, they were students on a field trip. Africa was the university. Kemet was the campus. They crossed the Mediterranean like kids crossing town to sit at the feet of the elders. They came with questions. Africa had answers. They came with curiosity. Africa had libraries built from stone, aligned with the stars, older than their entire civilization. They came with myths. Africa had mathematics. They came with stories. Africa had science. They came with wonder. Africa had wisdom. See, Europe was still arguing with the dark when Africa was measuring the distance between the sun and respect. While Europe was throwing bones and calling it fate, Africa was mapping out destiny with geometry, philosophy, medicine, and law etched into temples, tombs, and tongues. Before they called it philosophy, we called it ma'at, balance, order, truth, the cosmic receipts. Before they called it astronomy, we were tracking Sirius, timing the flood of the Nile, building calendars that made the sky look like a syllabus. Before they called it medicine, we were stitching wounds, setting bones, performing surgeries while Europe was still praying over infections and hoping. Before they called it architecture, we were raising pyramids so precise you still can't slide a razor blade between the stones, but open a European textbook and watch the magic trick. Suddenly, Greece invented thinking, Greece invented reason, Greece invented the mind. They turned our library into their origin story. They cropped Africa out of the frame, then told the world, this is where civilization began. That's not history. That's theft with good marketing. Yes, let's call names since they love to quote them. Pythagoras, that triangle man. He studied in Egypt, learned from priests who were engineers, astronomers, and spiritual scientists all at once. Plato, he sat in Kemet too, walked through temples that were universities before the word existed. He saw a system so advanced, he tried to copy it back home and called it the Republic. Solon, Thales, Democritus, the so-called fathers of this and that. They crossed into Africa, drank from our wells, then went home and sold the water with their names on the label. They weren't the fathers, they were the translators, middlemen, students who published the teacher's notes and signed the front page. Europe, stone huts, tribal wars, superstition dressed as certainty. Africa, cities with drainage systems, irrigation, universities, libraries that didn't just hold books, they held blueprints for human potential. Europe was still learning how to wash regularly, while Africa was mapping the human body, charting the soul, and designing social systems to keep cosmic order on the ground. They call their chaos history, and our genius myth. They say, these pyramids, aliens must have done that. Aliens? You can't imagine black hands being that precise, that patient, that divine with a ruler and a vision. They'll accept little green men before they accept black brilliance. That's not ignorance, that's strategy. Because once you admit Africa is the blueprint, the whole European ego starts shaking. Once you admit the Greeks were students of the Nile, then all those fancy words, Western civilization, Enlightenment, Renaissance, start looking like remixes with no feature credits. You start seeing Socrates as a man who listened to African echoes. You start seeing Aristotle as someone cataloging what we already knew. You start seeing Hippocrates as a medical intern in an African hospital. And suddenly the story of the world doesn't orbit around Europe anymore. It starts in the South. It starts in the dark skin they taught you to fear. It starts in the land they taught you to pity. They erased us from the front of the book and left us in the glossary. They buried our names and called it lost civilization. Lost? We were never lost. We were hidden, edited out, blacked out, literally. They took your grandmother's recipes, opened a restaurant in her name, and then banned her from eating there. That's what they did with African knowledge. Understand this. When you hear Greek philosophy, translate it in your head, African wisdom in a Greek accent. When you hear Western science, remember, it's an echo of African experiments, African observations, African conclusions cleaned up, renamed, and stripped of its roots. When they say, this is universal, ask them, whose universe? Who mapped it first? Who gave you the language to even describe it? Because the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a syllabus, a timeline, a living textbook. And the Greeks, they didn't discover it, they enrolled in it. Europe is the remix. Africa is the master recording. Europe is the translation. Africa is the original tongue. Europe is the echo. Africa is the voice. And once you see that clearly, you stop begging for a seat at their table and start remembering. We built palaces before they built chairs. You are not the afterthought of history. You are the starting line. And once you move like that, once you walk like the Nile runs in your veins, once you think knowing your ancestors were the teachers of the so-called masters, every classroom on this planet has to rearrange its desks. Every curriculum has to confess its lies. Every empire has to answer to its plagiarism. Because the day Africa remembers itself, the whole world's story has to be rewritten. Not from Greece, from the source, from you. First stop on this tour, let's walk into their holy temple, the classroom. Sit down in that little plastic chair, open that shiny textbook, and watch the magic trick. On page 1, civilization starts in Greece. Not in the Nile, not in Kemet, not in Kush, not in Nubia. No. History, according to them, wakes up in white marble, speaks with a Greek accent, and pretends the desert never raised a genius. They call it Western civilization. I call it Africa with the labels ripped off, because here's the part they whisper in footnotes and bury in specialist books you'll never see in a high school class. Those Greek masters were students, and their teacher? Africa, specifically Black Egypt. You know those big Greek names they make you memorize like a spell? Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, Herodotus, Thales, Solon. They parade them like they invented thinking, like they woke up one day, stretched, and philosophy just fell out their mouths. But dig into their own stories, their own writings, and you'll see it. They traveled, they studied, they sat at the feet of African priests, African scribes, African builders, African astronomers, African healers. They crossed the sea, stood in temples older than their entire nation, and took notes like hungry students in the back row. Herodotus, the one they call the father of history, walked into Kemet and said with his own pen, "These people are dark with woolly hair." He wasn't describing Sweden. He wasn't in Rome. He was standing in Africa looking at Africans, trying to understand a civilization that made his homeland look like a little brother still learning to read. But in your school book, Egypt gets washed, bleached, separated from Africa like it ain't sitting right there on the continent with Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Congo, Ghana, Nigeria. They'll teach you about the Greeks, with full-color portraits, glowing descriptions, and whole chapters. Then Egypt, 2 pages, a pyramid, a pharaoh, and some cartoon mummies. They treat Africa like a side note to Europe's main story. But pull back the curtain. Before there was a Plato, there were African mystery schools teaching the science of the soul. Before there was Aristotle, there were African libraries stacked with scrolls on math, medicine, astronomy, ethics, statecraft, architecture. Before there was Hippocrates, there were African doctors documenting surgeries, fractures, herbs, and diagnoses on papyrus, while Europe still thought thunder was God's anger. But in their classroom, they flip the script. Africa becomes the myth. Greece becomes the mind. Africa becomes the pyramid. Greece becomes the idea. Africa becomes the backdrop. Greece becomes the actor. That's not education. That's stage lighting. They dim the sun and put a flashlight on a copycat. Understand this. Greek philosophy is African wisdom translated through a new accent. Greek geometry is Nile Valley land surveying with a Greek signature. Greek myths are remixed echoes of stories older than their alphabet. But when Europe rose to power, they did what all empires do. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered memory. They raided libraries, burned records, renamed gods, renamed lands, renamed people, then stood in the ashes and said, "We discovered this." They turned your ancestors into influences, possible sources, earlier cultures, while crowning themselves the origin. That's how you erase a giant and build a hero out of a student. So when you sit in that class and the teacher says Greek philosophy is the foundation of Western thought, you need to hear the missing line. Stan Aphrodam ik and a cowsherb, and Western thought is standing on African shoulders it refuses to name. They tell you Europe gave the world democracy, science, rationality, art, architecture, while Africa gave the world drums, tribes, and colorful culture. No, Africa gave the world time, measured by stars. Africa gave the world writing, sacred symbols carved in stone. Africa gave the world medicine, documented, tested, refined. Africa gave the world organized spiritual systems, ethical codes, state bureaucracy, irrigation, engineering, calendar systems, geometry, and a concept of the soul so deep, Europe's still quoting it and calling it New Age. But because Europe controlled the printing press, the universities, the museums, the movie studios, they could remix the story. Africa, early, primitive, then colonized, saved, and civilized. Europe, late arrival, but somehow the main character. They turned theft into inspiration. They turned cultural robbery into Renaissance. They turned your genius into their classics. Now, understand something. I'm not here to hate Greece. I'm here to put it back in its proper seat. Greece was a bridge, not the source, a student, not the origin, an echo, not the first voice. When you know that, the whole classroom changes. You stop looking at Greece like your father and start seeing it as your younger cousin who read your grandmother's notebooks and then acted like he wrote them. That's why they fight so hard to keep Egypt floating in the middle, not really black, not really African, because if Egypt sits firmly in Africa, then Africa becomes the mother of philosophy, the mother of science, the mother of religion, the mother of mathematics, the mother of architecture. And suddenly, Europe looks like what it is, the child who borrowed and never gave credit. Now, watch how this plays out in every institution. In school, they erase the teacher and crown the student. In church, they repaint the prophets, the saviors, the angels, until heaven looks like Northern Europe in the winter. In museums, they put African artifacts behind glass in London, Paris, Berlin, then call them World Heritage instead of stolen family heirlooms. In movies, they cast your stories with their faces, film your lands with their heroes, tell your myths in their voice. Same trick, different stage. But we're not done. You've seen how they dimmed Africa and spotlighted Europe in the classroom, how they stole from Kemet and called it Greece, how they turned black genius into white marble statues. Next, we're walking into their churches, their museums, their movie sets, and I'm going to show you how they bent God's face, locked your ancestors' art in foreign vaults, and filmed your history with you missing from the frame. Then, we flip their stage lights, we pull the receipts, we call the roll, and the world will have to say your ancestors' names with a tremble, with gratitude, with respect in every classroom, every pulpit, every gallery, every screen on this earth. Europe wrote the story. Africa lived it. Europe had scrolls. Africa had stone. One fades, one stands. See, by the time Greece was learning to walk, Kemet was already running universities on the Nile. Before Plato was pondering, priests in Luxor were mapping the stars, measuring the soul, weighing the heart. They tell you Western civilization like it fell from the sky in a white toga. Nah, it crossed the Mediterranean on borrowed boats, studied under black teachers, then came back home claiming, I discovered thought. Pythagoras? He studied in Kemet for years. Geometry wasn't born in Athens. It was carved into pyramids, measured in cubits, aligned with Orion, while Europe was still trying to light a proper fire. Plato? He sat at the feet of Nile sages, then went back and opened academies off the blueprint of African mystery schools. They rebranded your temple as their campus, your cosmology as their philosophy, your ma'at as their ethics. They took Imhotep, the original scientist, architect, healer, and buried his name under Greek syllables, turned Tahuti into Thoth, Ausar into Osiris, Auset into Isis, like your gods. Needed a European accent to be taken serious. Europe was the remix. Africa was the original track. But when they wrote the textbooks, they cropped the picture, cut out the melanin, cut out the Nile, cut out the temples, left you with a story that starts in Athens and pretends the sun rises in the west. They told you civilization began with the Greeks. While standing in museums full of African artifacts, they dug up, shipped out, and put behind glass. They wrote your genius in footnotes, their names in bold, your inventions in small print, their faces on the cover. But let's be clear, Greece was a student. Africa was the teacher. Europe came with questions. Africa had answers etched in granite, painted on tomb walls, hidden in proverbs, coded in drum patterns, whispered in initiation halls by candlelight. They studied your medicine, then called it Hippocratic, studied your numbers, then called it Pythagorean, studied your mysteries, then called it Hermetic. They didn't just learn, they renamed, repackaged, resold. So now when you say, I'm from Africa, they picture poverty, not philosophy. They see charity, not chemistry. They see safari, not universities older than their entire lineage. Europe gave you castles. Africa gave you pyramids. Europe gave you crusades. Africa gave you ma'at, balance, order, truth, reciprocity, a moral code older than their holy books. Europe wrote laws. Africa wrote principles. One controls bodies, the other guides souls. Understand this. When the Greeks came south, they came to learn. When later Europeans came south, they came to erase, to bury, to plagiarize the roots and claim the fruits. They built their enlightenment on your daylight, then told you to be grateful for the candle. But the Nile remembers, the stones remember. The stars still line up with your ancestors' math, not Europe's ego. So when they say, Western thought, Western science, Western philosophy, hear what they're not saying. We studied Africa, stole the answers, changed the names, and called it ours. Not from Greece, from the source, from you. And until you see that, they keep the crown. The day you remember that, the crown goes home. So when they tell you civilization began in Greece, you look them dead in the eye and whisper, which Greece? The one that sat at Kemet's feet, the one that studied in black temples, read from black scrolls, and walked through black columns trying to decode black genius? Because let's be clear, Greece wasn't a miracle. Greece was a memory, a remix, a translation of lessons first carved in stone along the Nile. They took your myths, called them philosophy, took your healing, called it medicine, took your star maps, called it astronomy, took your soul science, called it mystery schools. They went to Kemet like students, came back to Europe like prophets, and the world bowed down to the copy while the original was buried under sand and slander. They wrote your teachers out the script, bleached the cast, changed the setting, and called it universal. But the universe remembers. The Nile remembers. The sandstone remembers. The broken noses on the statues remember. The temples half buried in dust remember. And your bones remember. That's why something in you never sat right with those schoolbook stories. Why the timelines felt crooked. Why the maps felt rigged. Why the heroes they gave you never looked like the power you felt in your own reflection. Because deep down, your DNA been humming, I was here first. Before the toga, there was the kilt of linen. Before the olive wreath, there was the crown of Upper and Lower Kemet. Before Socrates asked a question, your ancestors were questioning the stars. Before Pythagoras drew a triangle, your builders were measuring pyramids with math that still breaks calculators. They walked into your libraries, stood under your ceilings of painted sky, and learned how to think, how to count, how to heal, how to rule, how to speak to the divine. Then, centuries later, their children turned around, pointed at you, and called you primitive. That's not just a lie, that's a theft, a ritual erasure. But hear me, you can't erase the sun by closing your eyes. You can't bury a river by drawing a new map. The truth leaks. The truth rises. The truth returns. Now the receipts are surfacing. The names are resurfacing. Imhotep, Ptah-hotep, Amenemope, Akhenaten, Merit Ptah, Hypatia of Alexandria, the black woman scholar they tried to turn into a footnote, and behind them 1,000 more whose names were never written in Western ink, but live in stone, in blood, in rhythm, in you. So no, we're not begging for a seat at anyone's table. We built the first tables, measured the first angles, mapped the first heavens, laid the first bricks of what they now call Western thought. The West is standing on African foundations, wearing African wisdom in a Greek accent. And now the echo is over. Now the original steps forward. We pull the receipts. We call the roll. And the world will have to say your ancestors' names with a tremble, with gratitude, with respect, in every classroom, every pulpit, every gallery, every screen on this earth. And when they ask, why does it matter who taught who? You tell them, because a stolen story breeds a stolen people. Because if they convince you you came from nothing, you'll accept anything. Because if they hide your beginning, they can script your ending. But the ending is changing. Right here. Right now. This is not nostalgia. This is not ego. This is correction. This is resurrection. This is memory walking back into the room with its head held high. You are not the footnote. You are the first chapter. You are not the afterthought. You are the blueprint. Let that sit in your chest. Let that straighten your spine. Let that sharpen your tongue when your child comes home with a textbook that starts the story in Athens. You look that child in the eye and say, before they built their schools, we built civilizations. Before they wrote their theories, we wrote the cosmos in stone. Before they knew themselves, they came to us to learn how to be human. And then you hand them the names, you hand them the maps, you hand them the truth that they tried to bury. Because this is how the spell breaks. This is how the river returns to its original course. This is how a people, scattered and gaslit, stands back up in full height. No more shrinking, no more apologizing, no more acting like we're included when we are the source. The story is circling back. The credits are being corrected. The curtain is rising on the oldest cast the world has ever known. And the world will have to say your ancestors' names with a tremble, with gratitude, with respect, in every classroom, every pulpit, every gallery, every screen on this earth. Say it with me until it sinks in, until it heals, until it burns itself into the world's memory. The world will have to say your ancestors' names with a tremble, with gratitude, with respect, in every classroom, every pulpit, every gallery, every screen on this earth.